There was an orc woman who knelt in the mud beside a calf no one wanted, and the rancher who had left it there to die did not know yet that he had made the worst decision of his life. There was a Runt, and there was Mara, and there was the long, cold work of believing something small could grow into something that mattered. There was a Runt, and there was Mara, and everything that followed began in the mud, in the rain, in the particular silence of a creature that has stopped fighting. The rain that night came in sideways across the Gallican plain, the kind of rain that does not bother to announce itself, that simply arrives and stays. Mara had been walking the fence line of the Aldrath parcel, 40 acres she rented from a man named Corvus Aldrath, for 11 silver a season, land he considered barely worth the paper the lease was written on, when she heard it. Not a bellow, not the panicked cry a healthy calf makes when separated from its mother. Something smaller than that, a sound like a question no one expected to be answered. She found him in the ditch at the bottom of the eastern pasture, half submerged in runoff, his legs folded beneath him in the boneless way that said he had given up on standing. He was perhaps 6 hours old. His coat was roan gray and soaked flat against his ribs, which she could count 7 visible on one side alone. He was the smallest calf she had seen born in 3 years of watching Aldrath's herd, and she knew, without asking, that Aldrath had seen him too and made his calculation. Small animals cost feed. Small animals slow herds. Small animals, in Corvus Aldrath's arithmetic, were not animals at all. They were expenses. By the way, wherever in the world you are listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? She crouched beside him in the mud and pressed 2 fingers to the soft place beneath his jaw and felt his pulse. Weak, but there. Unsteady, but there. The rain kept coming. Her green skin was dark with water and cold, her tusks faintly luminous in the low cloud light the way orc bone sometimes is, and she stayed crouched for a long moment that was not really a decision so much as the recognition that a decision had already been made somewhere beneath the level of thought. She had been told all her life that she was good at surviving things no one expected her to survive. She had not thought until this moment that the quality might be transferable. She lifted him. He weighed, she would tell people later, approximately what a bad year feels like. She carried him the 1/4 mile back to her rented barn with her jaw set and the rain cold on the back of her neck. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Mara was and what she had come from, because the calf was not the first small thing she had tried to keep alive, and the mud was not the first place she had knelt. She had arrived in the Gallican Valley 3 years before the night of the ditch. In early spring, when the valley towns were still the kind of closed that only opens when someone arrives with something useful to offer. Mara arrived with 2 things: a 7-year-old daughter named Sova, who had her mother's gray-green coloring and her dead father's habit of saying exactly what she observed without editorial, and a 12-year-old daughter named Dresh, who had learned to be quiet the way children learn it, when quiet is a form of safety. She arrived with her daughters and with nothing else worth counting. She had left a man named Fen Dorok. She had left him on a morning in late autumn. After the 3rd time, he used the word worthless in conjunction with her daughters' faces, and something in her had gone very still in the way things go still before they move decisively. She did not shout. She did not explain. She gathered her daughters and what she could carry, and she walked out while the word was still hanging in the air of the kitchen, and she did not look back at it, because some words will follow you if you look at them. Fen Dorash was a man of standing in the Eastern Valley community. He had a house of dressed stone, a reputation for careful business, and a smile that arrived precisely when witnesses were present. He was half human, which in the Galifan Valley mattered in ways that were never spoken directly but were always understood. Mara was Orc, which also mattered in the same unspoken, perfectly understood way. When she had married him at 23, she had believed that love could outperform the arithmetic of community prejudice. She had been wrong about that. She had been right about very little during those 12 years. She sometimes thought in her lowest hours, except her daughters, she had been exactly right about her daughters. So she came to Galifan with Sova, who was 7, and Dresh, who was 12 and 40 acres of rented land. And the clothes they stood in and the specific species of dignity. She found work quickly, because she was competent in the particular way that people who have had to be competent become thoroughly, without waste, and without needing to be asked twice. She mended fences for Aldrath. She helped with calving season for a woman named Breck Holloway, who ran a small dairy operation 2 miles north, who paid fairly, and did not remark on Mara's appearance beyond a single, long, appraising look on the first morning that seemed to arrive at a satisfactory conclusion. She learned the land. She had always been good with animals. This was not a gift, so much as a form of attention. She watched them carefully. She read what they communicated before they communicated it loudly, and she responded to early signals instead of late ones. The animals, in return, were calmer around her than around most. Aldrath noticed this and said nothing, because noticing things about Orc women and saying nothing was something he was very practiced at. He noticed that the 40 acres produced more under her lease than under his direct management. He did not allow himself to notice why. She built a small herd over 2 years. 3 goats first, because goats are cheap and adaptable and do not require you to believe in the future the way cattle do. Then a milk cow, purchased from Breck Holloway at a fair price, payable over 6 months. Then a second cow, a gray shorthorn with a calm temperament and excellent maternal instincts, acquired in partial exchange for 3 months of fence work on a neighboring property. She was building slowly and carefully the way roots build beneath soil, without anyone watching, without ceremony, without anyone above the ground being quite aware that something was being established. Dresh, who was 15 by then, helped with the herd in the early mornings before the walk to the valley school. Sova, who was 10, had strong opinions about each animal individually and had named the gray shorthorn Persistence, a word she had encountered in a reader and applied with conviction. Persistence seemed, under the circumstances, like an entirely reasonable name. And then came the night of the rain and the ditch, and the calf who had been left to die. She laid him in the straw of the barn's south corner, the warmest spot, where the wall caught residual heat from the next building over. She rubbed him dry with coarse grain sacking. She heated water on the small iron stove and mixed in the dried colostrum supplement she kept on the 3rd shelf for emergencies. She had purchased it at the start of calving season because she believed in keeping what emergencies require before emergencies arrive, and she held the bucket to him and waited. He did not drink. She dipped her fingers and held them to his lips and waited again. He drank then, a little enough. She sat on the floor of the barn and kept the bucket warm between her knees, and fed him by hand for the next 4 hours. The rain hammered the roof. Dresh appeared at the barn door around the 2nd hour, wrapped in a blanket, having woken to the sound of her mother's absence, and she looked at the calf and at her mother and said, "Mara said, I don't know yet." Dresh sat down in the straw without another word and held the lantern steady while Mara worked. Sova found them in the morning, all 3 of them asleep against the south wall, the calf tucked between them, radiating the particular heat of a small animal that has decided in the night to keep going. The following day, Mara walked to Aldrath's main house and knocked at the door. Corvus Aldrath answered with the expression of a man interrupted in the process of calculating something. He was 51 years old, gray-bearded, tall in the way that has more to do with authority than actual height. He had the careful eyes of someone confident in his ability to assign value quickly. Where she had found him, what condition he was in, that she had him stable and feeding in her barn. Aldrath looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That calf was left deliberate. He's a runt. Mother wouldn't take him." "You've wasted a night," Mara said. "I'd like to purchase him." Aldrath said, "He's going to die." She said, "Maybe so. What's the price?" He named a price that reflected his certainty that he was taking her money for nothing. 2 silver, considerably below even the standard low-end price for a healthy calf, meant as a kind of mercy extended toward her coming disappointment. She paid it. She counted the coins into his hand, with the deliberateness of someone establishing a record, and she walked back to her barn in the early morning light. The calf she named Grunstone. Sova named him, technically, standing in the barn doorway on the 3rd morning and announcing the name with the certainty of a child who has already decided and is simply informing the world. When Mara asked where the word came from, Sova said it was the thing at the bottom that everything else is built on. Mara looked at the calf, who was on his feet now, unsteady but upright, his roan gray coat dry and beginning to fluff at the edges, and she said that sounded right. He was small. He remained small for longer than any calf she had watched grow, as if his body was checking cautiously whether size was safe. He drank from a bucket. He never did learn to suckle properly, which was fine because the bucket was what she could control, and he watched everything with large amber eyes that had, Dresh said once, the quality of someone who had seen bad weather and was simply waiting to see what came next. Mara said she knew the feeling. She introduced him to the rest of the herd carefully, first the goats whose acceptance meant something, and then Persistence the shorthorn, who investigated Grunstone with her long, dark nose, and made a sound that was not quite maternal, but he spent his first pasture nights sleeping against her side. She let him. The animals did what they needed to do. He grew. Slowly at first, and then, somewhere in his 2nd summer, as if he had waited until he trusted the ground enough to commit to it, he grew without stopping. By his 2nd autumn, he was no longer a runt. By his 2nd autumn, he was the largest young bull in any pasture Mara could see from her fence line, with a chest like a question asked loudly and a temperament so steady it seemed almost deliberate, as if he had decided early. She bred him carefully, disciplined in the way she was disciplined about everything, 3 steps ahead, enthusiasm never overriding arithmetic. The calves he threw in his 3rd and 4th seasons were remarkable in a way that people who know cattle can identify before they can articulate it. Something in the conformation, the density, the quietness of temperament. Breck Holloway saw them at market and said, "Plain as fact, those are the best-looking calves in this valley." Then she looked at Mara with an expression that contained no surprise whatsoever. Bod moved through the valley the way words do in small communities, not with announcement, but by accumulating in the space between conversations. The orc woman on the Aldrath parcel, the bull she'd bought off Aldrath for 2 silver, the calves, the herd. That was, by Mara's 4th season, 12 animals strong, with Grunstone at its center, the way a working foundation is at the center of everything built above it. She had saved enough by the end of the 4th season to approach Aldrath about purchasing the 40 acres outright. The purchase required a deposit of 30 silver and a land deed filed with the Valley Council. She knocked on his door on a clear morning in late autumn, put her proposal to him with the same directness she had put everything to him for 4 years, and watched him calculate. He said he would consider it. The word consider in the arithmetic of landowners calculating whether to sell to orc women could mean many things. She thanked him and walked home and began preparing for both outcomes. It was during the suspended, careful season of waiting that Fendorach reappeared. He had found her through the Valley Council's records office, where a man of standing with the right connections could locate a rental lease without difficulty. He arrived on a Tuesday in early winter, in a hired cart wearing a coat worth more than 2 months of her fence work. And he stepped down and looked at the 40 acres and the barn and the grazing animals in the field, and something moved behind his eyes that was not affection and not remorse. It was closer to the expression of a man who has recalculated and found the number larger than he remembered. He was at the fence line when he arrived. She saw him before he saw her, which was not accidental. She stood and waited, and the waiting was the kind of thing she was good at. He said her name, as if they had parted pleasantly. Said the place was looking well. Said he had thought about her often. Prafe. Said, and here was the part that cost him nothing because he had rehearsed it, that mistakes had been made, that he had grown, that some arrangement could be reached that would serve them both. Then, she said, "What arrangement?" He said he thought the girls needed a proper household. He thought a woman alone, especially given her circumstances. Here he paused, and the pause was shaped like her species, though he did not say the word, could not provide what a settled situation provided. He said he had spoken to a man at the Valley Council about the land purchase she had apparently been attempting. He said there might be questions about the provenance of certain funds, questions a friend at the council might be positioned to complicate or to smooth. She looked at him. The morning light was flat and cold. Grunstone was visible in the far pasture, enormous, and still against the frost-pale grass. She looked at him for a moment before she looked back at Fendorach. She said, "Come back on Thursday morning. I'll have an answer for you then." He smiled, the smile of a man accustomed to women who needed time to recognize their options, and said Thursday was fine, and got back into his hired cart and left. That evening she walked 2 miles north to Breck Holloway's dairy. Breck Holloway was 57 years old, broad-shouldered, and had been operating her dairy for 22 years, with the specific competence of someone who has survived enough difficult seasons to have stopped being surprised by difficulty. She had never been married. She had opinions about land law, Valley Council procedure, and Fen Dorash in particular, the last of which had been formed years before Mara arrived, and were not complimentary. She poured tea without asking, because she understood that people who come to your door in the evening need something warm in their hands before they can speak clearly. Mara told her everything, plainly, in order, without decoration. The calf, in the ditch, at 6 hours old. The 2 silver grunstone, the land purchase Aldrath's consideration, Fen Dorash arrival and his implication regarding the council connection. Breck listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, Breck set her cup down with the deliberateness of someone clearing space for a decision. She said, "The man he mentioned at the council, that would be Pel Aldrath, Corvus's cousin." Mara said, "I didn't know that." Breck said, "Most people don't, which is how it works." She paused. "There is also a woman named Counselor Wend, who has been looking for 18 months for a reason to put Pel Aldrath under formal review for exactly this kind of arrangement. I have been waiting for someone with a clean paper record and a specific incident to give her that reason." Mara said, "And my record," Breck said, "is as clean as the day you arrived. I have watched you build this operation for 4 years. Half this valley has. Whatever Fen Dorak thinks he has to threaten you with, the arithmetic is not in his favor if someone does it loudly, in front of witnesses." Mara said, "I need to be the one who speaks." She said, "Yes, you do." On Thursday morning, Fen Dorash arrived at the appointed time in the same hired cart, with the same composed expression, and he found considerably more on the 40 acres than he had anticipated. Mara was at the fence. Breck Holloway stood to her left, which was not accidental, because Breck's presence in this valley communicated something specific about the character of the person she stood beside. To Breck's left stood a man named Jorund, who had worked the legal documentation side of the Valley Council for 14 years and knew every irregularity that had passed through the records office in that time, including 3 separate transactions bearing Pel Aldrath's signature. Jorund had his records with him. He had made copies. 3 neighboring households had found reasons to be near their fence lines that morning. This was a small valley. People did not miss things. Fen Dorash stepped down from the cart and registered the scene with the expression of a man recalculating, and for a moment the calculation was visible on his face, which was, Mara thought, the most honest she had ever seen him. He began with the version of himself he deployed for public occasions, composed, reasonable, aggrieved in a measured way, concerned for the well-being of his daughters. Mara let him finish. She had practiced not the words, but the quality of stillness that allows someone to say a thing without the weight of someone else's performance pressing it out of shape before it is spoken. "But my daughters are not your daughters in any sense that was not legal and is not now. You waived claim to both of them in the separation agreement signed before a witness 3 years ago in the Eastern Valley Clerk's office. Jorund has a copy." Jorund held it up. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She said, "The funds I am using for the land purchase represent 4 seasons of documented work, recorded in a book I have kept since the first week of my tenancy. Every transaction. The book is available for any council review that wishes to conduct one, which I would welcome." She said, The land I am trying to purchase is land I have worked and improved at my own expense for 4 seasons. The 40 acres was losing hay by the 2nd season under direct management. It has not lost a bale since I leased it. Aldrath knows this. Several people have stood near his fence in the past year and observed this. She said, "You came here because you looked up from your stone house one day and calculated that what I have built is worth more than what you left. You're right, it is. But you did not build it, and you have no claim to it, and any suggestion to the council that my funds are improperly sourced will require an accounting of your own business with Pel Aldrath, which Jorund can provide in detail to Councillor Wend, who has been interested in that subject for some time." She stopped. The cold morning light sat on everything equally. Grunstone moved in the far pasture, unhurried, a vast, roan-gray shape against the frost. The neighboring fence lines were very quiet. Without performance there was not very much of him, and she had known this for a long time, but knowing it and seeing it plainly in daylight, in front of witnesses, were different things. She felt something in her chest that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, and was perhaps the specific feeling of a thing that has been closed for a long time simply opening. He said, in a voice smaller than any she had heard from him in 9 years, "I want no trouble," she said. "Then go." And he went. He got into the hired cart without looking back at the 40 acres, or the barn, or the figure in the far pasture, and the cart moved up the road toward the valley pass, and the sound of it diminished, and then it was simply gone. No one said anything for a moment. Then Sova, who was 11 and had stationed herself at the barn door with the entirely transparent pretense of doing something with a bucket, said in her carrying voice, "Is he gone?" Mara said, 4, 1. Mara said. Sova said good, and went back to whatever she was actually doing with the bucket. Breck made a sound that might have been a laugh. Jorund put his documents away with the care of a man who understands that what is written down endures. The neighbors along the fence lines became busy with other things. That evening, Corvus Aldrath knocked on Mara's door, which was a reversal of their usual arrangement, and caused him some mild discomfort he managed by standing very straight. He said he had heard about the morning. Mara said the valley was small. He said, "I've made my decision about the land. 30 silver. Standard deed. Filed Monday at the council." She said. Aldrath looked at the land, which was his habit when he needed a moment, then looked back at her and said, "You've done well by it." It was the most direct thing he had said to her in 4 years. She thought about what it cost a man like him to say it, and she did not make it a large moment, because making it large would have made it harder for him to have said it. She said, "Thank you, Aldrath." He said good evening, and walked back down the road in the early dark. She went inside to where her daughters were at the table. Dresh was doing something with figures, increasingly involved in the record side of the operation. Sova was drawing one of the calves from memory with charcoal, her tongue between her teeth, with the concentration of someone solving a serious problem. The room smelled of wood smoke and soup that had been on the back of the stove since morning. The lamp made a warm circle on the table. Mara sat down and said nothing about the deed, or the day, or Fendorash's departure, because her daughters did not need it explained. They had lived it with her in all the ways that mattered. Dresh looked up from her figures and said, "The registration comes through in 2 weeks, then." Mara said, "Monday filing. 2 weeks after, Dresch said, "I'll update the records." Sova, without looking up from her drawing, said, "Grunstone's going to have 10 calves next spring. I counted. Mara said he might have 7. Sova said 10. She did not correct her again. The land was hers from the Monday of the filing, practically if not yet officially. She had walked its fence line 100 times in 4 years, and now she walked it differently. The way you walk ground that has stopped being borrowed and become the thing you are accountable to in the long way. Grunstone had turned 5 by that spring. He was, by any objective measure, a remarkable animal. 640 pounds of calm, dense, roan-gray cattle with a conformation that brought buyers to her fence line to stand with a certain look of quiet wanting. She had bred him to 8 cows that year, 4 of her own and 4 belonging to neighboring operations, for a stud fee set at a price reflecting what she understood his calves to be worth, more than anyone had yet offered, and less than what they would offer next year. She was calibrated in the specific way that people who have survived on small margins calibrate themselves. Precisely, Breck Holloway came by on an afternoon in late spring to look at the new calves. She walked the pasture beside Mara in silence, in the comfortable way of 2 people who do not need to fill space. Then she said, "You know what this is worth?" Mara said, "I'm starting to." Breck said, "I mean in 20 years. Mara looked at the calves. She looked at Grunstone in the far corner, still and amber-eyed, the improbable thing she had carried through rain at 6 hours old, weighing approximately what a bad year feels like. She said, "I've been thinking about 20 years. Breck said, "Good." Then, with the directness that was her version of great warmth, "I'd like to talk to you about a formal partnership on the stud operation. I have land you could use for an expanded herd. I have connections to the northern market buyers. You have Grunstone and the breeding records and the management ability." Mara said, "You're talking about a business partnership." Breck said, "I am." Mara said, "Not a favor," Breck said. "No. A transaction. You provide something valuable. I provide something valuable. We are both better positioned than we would be alone." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes. Let's talk about it." Breck nodded once with the crisp finality of a woman checking an important item off a list, and turned to look at the calves again, and they stood at the fence together in the late spring light, and watched what had been built doing what it was built to do. The partnership papers were drawn up in the summer. Jorund handled the documentation with his usual precision and pronounced them sound, and they were filed alongside the land deed in the Valley Council records, which Mara had come to appreciate as a physical archive of the life she was assembling on paper as well as on the ground. Dresch, at 16, was keeping the full set of accounts with a fluency that went beyond what Mara had taught her. Jorund said carefully once that her abilities suggested a future perhaps extending beyond pasture fencing. Mara heard this and held it without responding, till she was sure what she thought. When she was sure, her daughters would go wherever they needed to go. The land would still be there. Sova, at 13, maintained a hand-drawn illustrated catalogue of every calf with a conscientiousness that impressed buyers who happened to see it and made them trust, irrationally but correctly. There were still days when Mara walked the fence line and felt the valley's particular quality of attention, the kind that notices a green-skinned woman and makes small decisions about what she is worth. It happened less often than it once had. Things had shifted. the way things shift in small communities when evidence accumulates long enough in one direction. Not through anyone deciding to be less prejudiced, because people rarely decide that as a general proposition. Through specific things, through the calves at market, that everyone acknowledged were exceptional. Through the documentation Runt held in his careful files, through Breck Holloway standing to the left of someone. Through Mara herself, who had never apologized for her presence and had made no speeches about it either, simply worked and stood when she needed to stand and spoke when she needed to speak, plainly and without performance. There was a morning in her 5th autumn on the land which was now her land, owned and documented and hers, when she walked out to the far pasture before the others were awake and found grunstone standing in the early mist which hung in soft layers across the frost-pale grass. She leaned on the fence and looked at him and thought about the night in the ditch and the count of his visible ribs and the sound he had made that was smaller than a bellow, smaller than a cry, something closer to a question. He was now the answer to a great many questions she had not yet known she was asking. She had lost things that she still felt as losses. The years with Fendorash she did not get back. The particular version of her younger self, who had believed in the wrong things with great sincerity. The marriage that had been, in the end, only a performance of marriage in front of witnesses, while something else entirely occurred off stage. She did not pretend these were not losses. She held them accurately. But she had learned something in the 5 years on the 40 acres, something she thought about in the early morning with the mist on the pasture and the big amber-eyed bull standing patient and still in the middle of his field. It only asks what you will do with it now, and what you do with it now is what becomes the story. She found Grek at the fence on a morning in late autumn, the pale, cold sky emptied out above them. Breck had brought a ledger and 2 cups of tea in a satchel, combining warmth with efficiency in the way she combined everything. They sat on the fence rails and went through the autumn numbers, which were better than either of them had projected in the spring. At some point, Breck said, without particular lead-up, "I want to ask you something." Mara said, "Ask." Breck said, "I have run this dairy for 22 years, and I have managed it alone for 22 years. And I am 57 years old, and I am not tired of the work, but I am tired of the particular quality of alone that comes at the end of long days." She looked at the pasture instead of at Mara while she said this. Mara looked at the pasture too. Breck said, "I am not talking about a romantic arrangement in any form I can currently articulate clearly, and I may never be able to articulate it clearly. I am asking you now, because I have decided that waiting until I can articulate it clearly means—" Mara was quiet for a moment. The cold light sat on the frost. Grunstone was visible in the far corner of the pasture, enormous and patient. She said, "I know what you're asking," Breck said, and Mara said, "Yes." Breck said, "Right." She nodded once, picked up her ledger, and returned to the autumn numbers because there was still the rest of the ledger to go through. And the numbers did not organize themselves. And Mara picked up her tea and understood that this was what Breck Holloway's version of a great moment looked like, and found it, without qualification, exactly right. The winter that year was long but not cruel. There was enough feed. There were enough lamplight hours at the table. Dresch was preparing papers for an apprenticeship at the Valley's documentation office, a position Runt had recommended her for, with a formal letter that described her abilities in terms that made Mara read it twice. Sova had expanded her illustrated catalogue to include Grunstone's first-generation calves and their offspring, and she had begun assigning each animal a brief biography that she read aloud at dinner, with the conviction of someone who found the dramatic dimensions of each calf's life genuinely compelling. They agreed. It was a good winter. In the spring, on the 40 acres of land that was hers by deed and by 4 years of fence work and by the long, patient arithmetic of building, she stood in the morning light, in the south pasture, with Breck beside her, and watched the first of Grunstone's sixth-season calves find its legs in the frost-bright grass. Not weakness, but simply the process of calibrating to ground you have not yet learned to trust. She thought of a ditch and a night of rain, and a pulse beneath 2 fingers. She thought of the word she had arrived at in her first season, as a way of carrying the thing she was trying to hold, that some lives have their whole shape waiting in a moment that looks like an ending. The calf in the ditch had looked like an ending. The morning she walked out of Fandorosh's kitchen had felt like an ending. The valley that had looked at her in calculated smallness had seemed, sometimes, like a verdict. None of it had been the thing it looked like. She thought, watching the new calf take its second attempt at standing and succeed, that the truest thing she had learned was this: you do not heal by erasing what came before. You heal by building what comes after large enough to stand beside it. The loss and the new thing share the ground. The grief and the forward motion occupy the same pasture. You build the fence line wide enough to hold both. The calf stood. He was roan gray like his sire. His eyes, when he turned them toward the morning, were amber and patient and interested in what came next. Sova, at the fence in her coat with a piece of charcoal already in her hand, said, "He needs a name." Mara looked at the calf. She looked at Breck, who was watching with the expression she used when she was not allowing herself to feel something completely, because completely was more than she currently had available. She looked at her land, her fence line, her herd, the big roan gray bull in the far corner, who had been carried through rain and doubt in a man's arithmetic at 6 hours old and had become the ground on which everything else was built. She said to Sova, "What do you think?" Sova considered this with the seriousness she brought to all nomenclature decisions, which was the seriousness of someone who understood that names are not casual. She looked at the morning. She said something that means what happens next. Mara said, "Yes, something that means what happens next." The mist was lifting across the 40 acres. The grass was pale gold at the roots and deepening toward green at the tips. The new calf put his head down and found the grass, and began. Smoke rose from Breck's dairy chimney 2 miles north. The land held everything it had been given, and asked for nothing except to be worked honestly, which was, Mara thought, a reasonable arrangement, the kind she knew how to keep. She stayed at the fence a while longer, the cold air on her face, the morning opening around her in all directions, and she let it. She let it open.